Hello and welcome to all coaches, parents and players tuning into this presentation today. My name is Connor Clancy and I'm going to bring you through a presentation on athlete load monitoring, GPS technology, its applications and the considerations around its use. So a little background on myself before we start. I've been working with STATSports for over 3 years as a sports scientist, and I've had the opportunity to work with the German national team over the last year and a half during the European qualifying campaign, as well as the UEFA Nations League and into the European Championships next summer. So without further ado, I'll bring you through the presentation. So to start, who are we as a company? We're an Irish company founded in 2008. We're the makers of the Apex device, and we're providers of performance monitoring systems for elite teams and individuals. So amongst our clientele is up to 14 of the Premier League teams at the moment, as well as some international powerhouses such as the English FA, Brazilian FA, and German FA, as I mentioned. We've also partnered up with some of the top professional players in the Premier League. For example, Raheem, Sterling, and Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, as you can see, to bring our brand forward as much as we possibly can. So to start, I suppose the best place to start is what is GPS, what is in the black box that's going to be in the vest of the players, as you see in any training session or game with the elite teams, and now more and more commonly with individual users. So within the unit itself are multiple processors, so an accelerometer, a magnetometer, a gyroscope, as well as the actual GPS chip itself. But I won't go into too much detail on that. But what those key components do is bring the metrics to light. So there's an onboard metric calculator that calculates all the metrics for your total distance, high speed, all your acceleration work through those processors. So Global Positioning System is the abbreviation GPS. So it's a satellite navigation network that provides location and time information of tracking devices. So simply put, it shows you exactly where you are in terms of your distance figures, as well as all your acceleration work once you're in an outdoor setting. So GPS technology is used by many sports to quantify movement demands during training and competition. And the key benefits to it are threefold. So number one, increased performance. Number two, reducing injury risk. And number three, performance feedback. And each one of those I will touch on as we go along. So speed zones, I'm going to start with speed zones because they're a key part to what we do in our elite space especially, but more and more going to be pushed into the consumer market with the Coach Series product as well. So most of our products will have 6 customizable speed zone bands. With the Coach Series product, you'll have your high speed running threshold as well as your sprint threshold, which I'll bring you through further later. But the absolute zones refer to kind of fixed values typically derived from research. And the relative zones then look at the individual players and try to make individual zones for each player, because obviously between different positional demands and different athletic profiles, each player will be completely different. So in the software, this is what it looks like in terms of zone 1 and 2 being walking distance, zone 3 and 4 being your low to medium intensity running, and your zone 5 to 6 then being your high speed running. So with the Coach Series and the Athlete Series products, this high speed running figure that you will see will be everything above that 5.5 meters per second default threshold that you see on the bands here. And your sprint threshold then will be customizable for you on your Apex Athlete Series app. So why do we use speed zones? As I said, each player is completely individual for their speed and their athletic profile. So as you can see on the right here, there's a little bit of a research study around English Premier League Academy Soccer and the different demands of each position. So for example, without going into too much detail, you can pause the presentation and have a quick look for yourself. But the likes of wide attackers, wide defenders, their sprinting demand and their high intensity acceleration demand will be higher. while the likes of your central defenders, central midfielders will have a lower overall physical demand from a central defender's point of view. Central midfielder will have a huge amount more total distance demand and kind of higher moderate intensity acceleration demands in comparison to that high intensity acceleration demand needed for those wing players. The football game demands for each kind of level. I've broken it down here in terms of the Football League, the Premier League, under 23 demands, La Liga international and women's international figures. This is all coming from the research. So what you can take from this very quickly is the central defenders, wide defenders, central midfielders, wingers and strikers have all different demands. So when you're training to carry out a certain role, you've got to be able to know that each player is different. Each player should be training a little bit differently and aiming for different targets. So what influences GPS game data? There's so many different factors that come into play. The four main ones that I have looked at here is formation as number one. So the actual formation that a team plays is going to have a huge effect on the physical demands on each position. So for example, a 3-5-2 formation has the highest total distance, high speed running and HMLD demands, while a 4-2-3-1 will have higher accel decel demands. There's so many different factors that even go into the formation. And kind of what positions will have what demands. So a centre midfielder in a 4-3-3 covers over 11% more total distance than a 4-4-2. And another example there is a forward or striker will have, in a 3-5-2, covers over 45% more high-speed running than in a 4-2-3-1. So that's hugely important while preparing for a game and preparing for a season. If a certain team is mixing and matching between formations, they just need to know that the actual demands and the physical profile of the player that they will need to put that formation into play will be a lot different. Number two then is the difficulty of the game. So similar high intensity running figures for games with differing score lines, but the positional differences, so the likes of a centre back or 17% less, or a striker 15% more high intensity running and matches heavily won versus lost. So what does that mean? Very simply, if you're winning a game by a huge margin, so if it's a very easy game, your forwards are going to have a lot more high intensity running because the ball is going to be in that side of the pitch quite a lot more in comparison to your centre back, who will have a lot less physical demands. Possession is another one. So 4-5-1 covers a lot less high intensity running when in possession, but more when out of possession compared to a 4-4-2 or a 4-3-3. So that simply put then is, while in possession, it depends on the strategy of play and how the philosophy that a team has. If there is going to be a lot of possession play, the high intensity running figures will be lower. And then obviously the importance of the game will have a little bit of an effect as well. However, there's no differences overall in high intensity running for the importance of a game. However, the declines across halves only occurred in second halves of critical matches. So that again, broken down, is the more important a game, the bigger drop off in a second half. So that might be due to a little bit of fatigue in a second half due to maybe a little bit of stress or whatever that might be, and maybe a little bit more energy expended in the first half. And then substitutes cover 15% more high intensity running in the same time period compared to if they played the full game. So obviously from a starting player compared to a substitute, that substitute is going to cover a lot more high intensity distance when they come on per minute than a player that starts the game. That's just another factor that needs to be taken into account when setting out training sessions and games for a certain period. So I just have a little case study here that will clear up a lot of different myths that might be had by coaches and players alike. So player A here is a central defensive midfielder and player B is a central attacking midfielder. They both have very similar high-speed running outputs for the game. So 816 against 811 meters. So it's basically the exact same high-speed running output. So what a coach might take that as, or a player might take that as when they look at their Athlete Series app or they look at their Coach Series app, is both players had a similar kind of game in terms of output, and they might have done the exact same kind of role on the pitch, which is completely false. As you can see below the graphs, the central defensive midfielder spent a lot of that high-speed running figures while out of play, you know, so covering back during a set piece or something like that, and even more so than the out of possession rather than in possession. But on the other side of the coin, then the central attacking midfielder spent the absolute vast majority of the time in possession. That was when they hit their high-speed running figures. So if we kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, the player A match report, that central defensive midfielder that I was talking about, you can see the heat maps and those sprint maps that you can see on your Athlete Series app on the left-hand side. And what you can see on the right-hand side is just a little gauge into what the physical demands of that game were. Also, you can see the likes of your actual technical side of the game in terms of the attempted tackles, chances created, etc. on the top right. The player B report then looks a lot different in terms of the heat map and your sprints, but where the real difference is that total distance figure and the number of sprints, the max speed figures, so that we can show them side by side. You can see the massive difference. So the central defensive midfielder, for example, covers 12.2 kilometers. The central attacking midfielder actually only covered 9.5 kilometers. So that 3 kilometer difference is huge, as well as the max speed being higher for the defensive midfielder, number of sprints being higher for the central defensive midfielder. So you've got to take into account all of these data points rather than just looking at one. So if you just looked at the high-speed running figure that I showed you, you would think that they had a very similar game. But actually, when you drill a bit deeper, you can see that they were actually very different in terms of their output. So there's a question for a coach, you know, how would you rate each player's performance now? So how do they compare? So having as much data as you want is great, and having a million pieces of data is fantastic, but you've really got to be able to drill into it, have a look, and actually be able to take a proper takeaway point from it to see actually how they performed in a football sense and how they performed then in their physical demands. So periodization, I'll move on to next. So periodization is such a huge part of preparing a team for a full season. So simply put, it's simply the planning and monitoring of training in order to facilitate the right adaptations at the right time to lead to success in competition. So this is kind of what periodization looks like. I'll run through this quite quickly. So this is a full year, a full season. So between loading and overreaching, you can see a little bit of overload, but what you want to try and avoid is that real overtraining. So if you see the dotted blue line, so you've actually trained too much, training too hard, too little recovery, and it will lead to overtraining and it will lead to injury. So what you're trying to do with the assistance of the GPS is to recover, to load properly, to be able to give enough time to recover, and then to peak at the right time for competitive games, and then to come back down and actually start the process again. So matchday periodization is completely different in all sports. So the actual concept is the same for football, rugby, hockey, you name it, but the actual concept is a little bit different for each sport, as you know. So the conceptual periodization model may not be fully suited to every squad or every sport. So training needs to be structured so that the players are ready to compete on match day. That's kind of key points for any sport. Training needs to be built up with game day in mind. So as a practitioner, you need to be able to plan your training around the game schedule, as I said. So on top of that, special considerations must be given for non-participants in the game. So examples include substitutes and injured players. So you're not going to train a person that played 90 minutes the same as a player that only came on for 10 minutes. So matchday periodization broken down then, how do you kind of use that information to make the most out of your GPS data? You use the matchday concept here that I have. So if you have a match day, you can use the matchday +1, +2, kind of -2, -1 concepts to kind of look into it more deeply. So you might have a matchday -2 target. So 2 days out from a game, you might want to hit a certain amount of distance, a certain amount of high-speed running. And the more and more data that you get in for your players and your team, you can really start to make these targets really well done in terms of being able to have the exact amount of training demands that you need so that your players will be full of energy, ready to go on game day. So a periodization broken down even more in terms of just a 1 week look. So the 1 week look that you can see at the top, so that one game in a week. So you can see the match day competition at the end of the week. What you'll have is you'll have a recovery focus straight after the previous game, and then you'll have that adaptive focus, so that kind of training loading phase during the middle of the week, match day -4, match day -3, and then match day -2 and match day -1, you'll have a little taper focus. So that means you'll just take a little bit of the load off the training, but you'll keep the intensity high, but the volume mightn't be as high. So you'll have along the left-hand side, again, if you want to stop and have a read through of what all the phases mean. So the recovery, regeneration phase, that loading phase that I talked about, and then the taper phase. Special considerations, like I said, return to play candidates. So any players returning from injury and aiming to return to the pre-injury physical capacity should not complete the same workload as the rest of the squad. That's the same for substitutes, and that's the same for reserve players that aren't carrying out as much match load as the first team players. Fixture congestion is another thing. So unexpected fixture changes or progression in multiple competitions concurrently can present training load obstacles. So for the kind of Premier League example is, if you have a European game and an FA Cup game or a League Cup game during a week, as well as the Premier League game, you're obviously going to have to change and alter your training structure around that. So there's not going to be as much training in that kind of a week that you're going to have 2 or 3 games than just a normal week that you only have 1 game. That's just a little kind of example of what a kind of a Premier League team does from the research. So it's completely different for every week. So each coach and each player needs to be able to kind of look forward over the next couple of weeks and next couple of months and be able to put a strategy in place that will give them the best opportunity to be perfectly prepared for the real competitive phases and the really important parts of the season. So on the right hand side, you can just see a couple of examples of what a week might look like. So this is a 3-game week. So you can see there's not much loading, not much of a loading phase for the starters. So the starters table is on the top. So it's purely recovery, between games rather than actually any loading phase. But on the bench, in terms of substitute players or return to play players at the bottom, there is that normal look in terms of that loading and tapering look, as well as your recovery post games. So data reporting can look a huge amount of different ways. So obviously with the athlete series and the coach series apps, you're going to have that PDF report look, as well as obviously all the visualizations on the app itself. So there's multiple ways that you can look at data, and that's just kind of a couple of examples there. Acute chronic workload ratio is just another thing that I'm going to touch on briefly. So you might have heard of this, or you might not have. Again, have a look through some of the research on it if you have a little bit of interest in it. But what basically it is an acute chronic is looking at the workload in the last 7 days, so that workload in the last week against the workload over the previous 28 days. So basically what it's doing is it's looking at a ratio of what we've done this week as a training load versus what we've done in the last month. So what you want to do is, if I actually show you this graph, will explain it the best. What you want that ratio to be is kind of between that 85% and 150 and 120%. So simply put, there's an example here on the left in terms of if you want to build up or have a week, you don't want that 1 week to have a huge amount more training load or a huge amount less training load than you have done on average in the last month. That's basically it, simply put. There's multiple ways to kind of look into it and try and make it as applicable as possible to each team. But as I said at the start, I will put up my details at the end, and if there's any kind of questions around this, just feel free to fire me over a message. Return to play is another thing that us at STATSports and GPS technology has a huge part to play in. So returning injured players to a point that they are able to play in a limited and ultimately a full manner is key for any club, of course. So quantifying and monitoring that training load is key. So that GPS and your athlete series units and the coach series app will actually give you that opportunity to, so if there is any unfortunate event that a player is injured and has to come back from an ankle or a knee injury or whatever it's going to be, or a hamstring injury, you're going to be able to use the GPS to build them up slowly to a point that they're actually back to the point that they can actually play again in a limited manner, and then obviously ultimately to get them back into a full game. So the kind of key metrics that you're going to be looking at from that point of view is obviously your total distance and high speed running figures that you're usually hitting. So you'll know the average for each player for a game, and what you'll be able to do when they're returning from an injury is to see in training sessions, are they hitting the same stats as the other players in a training session? And as well as that, are they coming back to themselves in terms of, are they comparing to what they usually hit when they're fully healthy? So RPE versus GPS. Another thing, it's just another tool that you can use. So from a coaching standpoint, or even just from a player standpoint, to use this for their own guidance. Obviously, with the GPS use, you have use of the GPS now, and that's kind of a key part of preparation and injury prevention. But RPE is another way of doing it. So RPE is just a rating of perceived exertion. So it's just another layer of data that you can have. So it's literally just after a training session, a player will be asked how hard or how easy they thought the session was. And then you can obviously match this up with, are we actually matching the intensity that we targeted for this session? We wanted it to be a very difficult session, but the players thought it was actually only somewhat hard or fairly light. Then you can actually start to gain an appreciation for what training sessions are actually really intense for players, which might be a lot of acceleration, deceleration work and high speed running, and what actually they find quite easy, which could be, it could be quite a lot of total distance, but not a lot of that intense work that I spoke about. So basically, the kind of key considerations to kind of wrap up this presentation as much as we can, the key consideration is, as I said, you can have a million pieces of data. From a coaching point of view, you're going to have quite a lot of data in terms of for all of your players. But the key is, and this is from Tom Allen from Arsenal, one of our key users and a very good user. So the technology and data will never affect the outcome, he says. So the people interpreting that data will. So the GPS unit isn't going to win you a game of football. Absolutely not. What it's going to give you the tools to do is to prepare the players as best as you can for game days and for competitive action. But it really does come down to slowly but surely learning about what the figures mean, and being able to interpret that as much as you can. So as I said, so it's important that users understand what the data means. We obviously have a huge amount of learn functions on the apps, and you obviously have contact with us, and you can ask any questions that you want as we go along. But as you know, using the GPS will be a huge addition to the team. From a player's point of view, it's going to be great for to buy into training and get a competitive edge with their teammates, and obviously with the opposition. And from a coaching point of view as well, it's a huge educational curve on this, and it'll help a lot in careers going forward. So that's the presentation as a whole. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to leave my details here. So absolutely don't hesitate to jump on, give me an email, and ask me anything that you need. Thank you.